I spent 27 days making my first app in Unreal Engine, taking it from this to this, and finally hosting it on the web via pixel streaming. Stick around to see how I did it. When starting any application, it's important to establish the basics. I had a background in architecture and a bit of experience implementing UI menus in Unreal, so I decided to stick with what I knew: architectural visualization. Basic ArchViz is usually pretty static, with still images and maybe the occasional animation. So I thought, how cool would it be to design an interactive ArchViz app? I picked up a recently completed design build that I had worked on and got cracking. This is Russell Heights Hub. It's a neighborhood in Ottawa, and over the last 2 years we worked with the community to revamp their youth house, basketball court, and play area. Being part of the community consultations from day one, I noticed that people from the neighborhood really responded to 3D renders, so I thought that making a more immersive format to share these designs could be a fun challenge. Now that I'd sorted out what I wanted to make, I wanted to focus my early motivation on things that I was less comfortable with: blueprints. Blueprints are Unreal Engine's version of visual scripting. This made the bar to entry much easier for me getting started. Beginning with a blank Unreal Engine project, I started off with basic navigation, based on some tutorials I watched from the Game Dev channel's building series. That's how I spent the first 4 days, creating basic WASD controls, but primarily relying on mouse controls, as that's what I was used to in architecture programs. I also added basic interaction, where a user can hover over an object to create a highlight. Using a post-process material, I created an outline on the custom depth channel, and then clicking the object focuses the camera onto the actor itself. Next, I needed to establish what the functionality of the app would be. The project itself was playful, so I wanted the UI to be as well, with hand-drawn icons, bold colors, and little menu animations. I went into my tablet and sketched all of my basic ideas out. The main features I wanted was a time of day and weather control, a basic timeline menu where you could visualize each site at the different phases of the build, and then finally a hotspots or point of interest menu, allowing you to see the models available at each of the phases and manipulate them further. I then started getting my models prepared in Rhino, which is an architectural modeling software that I was comfortable with. Luckily for me, I had a Photogrammetry model that I had made of the main building that's on there already, the youth house, the perfect model for getting started. I brought that into Rhino, and over the next 2 days, finished modeling that out and organized it into parts for easier texturing in Unreal. And then I exported it as a Datasmith file type, which made it super easy to bring into Unreal, and then using the Datasmith editor, begin to apply my materials, build nanite, and do whatever else I wanted to. Now, at this point, that front elevation wasn't looking exactly how I wanted it to be, especially since it was missing that mural. So I jumped back into Reality Capture, used my Photogrammetry model to create a bunch of ortho images that I'll use later to apply that mural back onto the building. On day 9, it was time to build out the scene. So I took all the models that I made in Rhino, brought them through the data prep process, and then added them directly to the scene. You can see for now that the main building is still using that photogrammetry mesh, but we'll swap that out soon enough. And for the trees, I decided to use a more stylized tree, something with a little bit less poly so that it could run on low-end devices as well. I also brought over the asset selection functionality, so a user could hover over to highlight the different objects in the scene, and then clicking them would select them on. Now this was a good change in pace after I got so used to staring at those cubes. One of the weird bugs that I came across was that whenever you'd select a new asset, the player pawn would just randomly drop. Now I found out that this was because my movement mode was set to walking, so that whenever I select a new object, gravity would smack my pawn down until it found a collision. Now I fixed that by changing it to flying, which caused a little bit of drifting whenever I moved around, but applying a braking deceleration node helped counteract that. On day 10, I created an asset manager blueprint. Now this stored all of the available actors in the scene, and would basically ensure that only one actor could be selected at a time. So if the user selected the actor 1, for example, then the asset manager would check if any actors are active. If not, it would select actor 1. For example, if the user selects asset 3, then it would deselect actor 1, and now actor 3 would be active. I then turned to the camera animation. When I first started off, I was using the camera lag as part of the spring arm. but I decided that I wanted something with a little bit more control. So I moved over to using a timeline node, which allowed me to control exactly the type of animation I wanted and the length. I could then use that to lerp in between the initial and the final location, rotation, and the length of my spring arm. Here's a quick before and after. On day 11, I was getting pretty darn tired of the gray squares as my buttons. I decided to switch them out for these icons I made earlier. While bringing the icons over as PNGs was easy, I wanted to create some hover and selection states and animations. Lucky for me, Epic had released a UI material lab that was free to use and full of really cool effects and animations. So I grabbed one of the buttons and applied it to my own. Then I attached an icon to all of my selectable actors, so that whenever you click a hotspot menu, a label for each model pops up. This label also scales based on the zoom by staying at the exact same pixel size on your screen, giving the effect of getting bigger as you zoom out and smaller as you zoom in. On day 12, I turned my focus onto a bug that had been plaguing my nightmares for weeks. I had noticed that there was a random lag spike whenever my camera was in the foliage. Now, I had picked stylized trees for this very reason, but apparently virtual shadow maps don't actually care about that. So off it went. My frames jumped from 7 frames per second to closer to 30. Much better. On day 13, I jumped back in to do a final pass on the UI. My scene was starting to look just about how I wanted it, so I added some screenshots into Figma and got cracking. The main goal for taking another pass at the UI was to really narrow down exactly what functionality I needed to implement, and then also create a bunch of different variations on what those menus could look like. This really helped me lay out exactly the general scheme of the app and really gave me clear direction on how to proceed when I came to the actual implementation phase. The first feature that I decided to focus on was the timeline menu. The goal for this menu is to be able to see the 4 different phases of the project, but then also have the ability to turn back time almost, and bring the site back to what it used to look like at the start of each of those phases. On day 15, I began thinking, this app works great and all in Editor, but does it actually run as a packaged build? This began a deep dive into a series of problems that all boiled down to the fact that I had downloaded the wrong version of Visual Studio. Thank you, random Reddit post. I fixed the Visual Studio version to 17.8, as that was what was recommended for Unreal 5.4, and boom, I had a packaged build that worked wonderfully on desktop.
It was all a lie. Guys, it was all a lie. She lied.
Yeah, not what you want to see. After updating the drivers and also plugging in my charger, you can see that we're back up to around 30 frames per second. Another fun thing is that my topple mesh was broken only on my laptop. Gonna have to come back to that one. With that little bit of a win under my belt, I continued implementing the timeline UI pop-up. Now, a little triangular caret tells you exactly which phase you're looking at, and on the right hand side, a little tidbit of information pops up about each individual design phase. I also implemented the Hotspot UI menu, so you can control the visibility of the models in each point of interest. Now, my hotspots were looking pretty sad at this point, with only one model type. So for the next couple days, I used some of the drone photographs and DSLR photos that I had to create photogrammetry-based point clouds in Reality Capture. To load them into the project, I used the LiDAR point cloud plugin. This allowed me to render it into the scene and attach them to the hotspots menu. I also decided to take this time to revisit the photogrammetry model that was currently serving as a placeholder in the middle of the scene. I wanted my BIM model that I had modeled out in Rhino to serve that purpose, so I took those orthographic images that I had made before and created normal maps using this online tool, and then created a material and applied them to the BIM models. I then had to do a little bit of UV reprojection just using Unreal's built-in tools, and voila, here is the results. Let me know what you think. Do you like the photogrammetry better or the BIM models? Personally, I like the BIM models a little bit better because it's cleaner, and it's broken down into parts which will be useful for later. On day 18, something about the hotspots menu just didn't sit right with me. I didn't like that you could only see one of the assets at a time. So I thought, what if we were to combine them all into one menu? Here's the combine menu that allows you to see all of the assets that are available, and clicking any of the drop downs allows you to easily load in that model into the scene. I also decided to take a pass at implementing the time of day menu. So what you can see here is I just had a very basic slider that allowed you to control the time of day. Now that same slider shows you a dynamic time update whenever you move it. It also gives you the ability to control cloud cover and precipitation. On day 19, now jumping around quite a bit, the first thing I implemented was the new settings menu. So you can now control the zoom sensitivity as well as the orbit sensitivity. On top of that, the point cloud material previously had an emissive texture applied. So going into the material node, I added one that had no emissive texture. Now this way, when it's actually rendered into the scene, it overlays really nicely where lighting actually doesn't now affect it. It's cool to get an idea of how the site actually used to look like before anything was built on top of it. Coming up to day 20, I thought it was about time to design a main menu and a way to actually exit the game, since people I figured would probably hate being trapped in the application forever. I wanted the main menu to still be sort of interactive with the actual scene. So one of the cool things I decided to implement was to have the time of day actually animate while you were in the main menu, and then whenever you press play, it would preserve that time of day. And then I began building out the scene with these context models that were made in Rhino, and then using Unreal, vertex painted for some weathering effects. I then spread these out across the scene, using Cesium's 3D Google tiles as a reference. Now the one downside with adding all of these meshes is that I mysteriously broke the entire selection functionality, especially when you're coming out of the main menu. But not to worry. After a little bit of tinkering, I was able to figure that out. Turns out I literally just had a widget covering the entire screen. You learn what you learn. Now the next day I was able to have a little bit more fun. One of the things I remembered from these community consultations was how much the kids had loved kind of picking up the models and just sort of breaking it down into its parts. So I thought, how cool would it be to create a similar assembly mode or displacement mode in the actual project? So you can click any models within the scene and break it into its parts. Now, at this point, the feature was still very much in its prototype phase, and you can see that with how clunky all of the building materials get extruded, and also how it's not quite consistent with each of the models. But it was a good start, and something we'll come back to a little bit later. I then returned to the Topo Mesh Black Spots bug on my laptop. I gotta figure out a better name for that. I tried to turn off Nane, and lo and behold, it worked. I don't know the exact reason, but I suspect it has something to do with the DirectX 12 reacting to my graphics card on my laptop. Maybe not updated drivers or something. I also took this time to revisit the camera focus functionality so that the player's point of view is always preserved. Here's the before and the after. I revisited the time of day menu and added controls for precipitation and seasons. The fun thing about the precipitation slider is that while moving it up and down in the winter season, also increases the amount of snow that's on the ground. Day 22 came around, and I thought that it might be time to show the application off to some friends. Now these were people that were familiar with the project and ended up getting some really great feedback. They helped point out some of the bugs with the project, but more so than that, they made a couple suggestions and gave me this picture, which was just a bunch of annotations over one of the drone photos. Hold on, maybe I could do something with this. On day 23, I added an info icon to each phase, and I implemented that directly into the hotspots menu. These annotations are automatically applied at runtime, and the way that that's done is that every actor in the scene has a component tag attached to them, and then I then have a widget that on construct searches through to find a matching tag in the meshes, and then if a matching tag is found, the description gets applied for the info pop-up. It then gets dynamically added to the scene whenever the info icon is pressed in the hotspots menu. To take it a step further, I made a spline that goes from the widget to the actual asset, and then I attached an arrow mesh across that spline. For some added interactivity, clicking on one of these pop-ups actually zooms you in and highlights that exact asset that it relates to. On day 24, I revisited the Displacement button, which breaks down the model into its parts. I changed the logic for the displacement functionality by leading a little bit more into the timeline node. For context, here's the before and the after. Sometimes simpler is better. This makes the animation much smoother, and then I reorganized the model itself so that the correct elements are grouped together. That way when you break apart the building, it breaks apart into the correct components. Now it's still not perfect, because even though it's breaking apart in the correct groups, it's not always breaking apart in the correct order, like maybe the structure shouldn't be up top, but hey, problem for another time. On day 25, I began adding some quality of life stuff. So the first big thing was the orbit anchor that you can see in the middle of the screen. So whenever you click a new object, the animated icon moves to the center of your selected actor to indicate the new anchor. The other big thing that I worked on was the pan function. So there previously wasn't a pan functionality, so I wanted to make something that allowed users with the middle mouse button to move up, down, left, right. Now it's still a little bit buggy, but it was a good start. Day 26 came around and I was feeling like the app was, more or less at the place that I wanted it to be. This was just supposed to be a prototype app, so I didn't want to put too much into it and had already added a couple last minute pieces of functionality that weren't part of the original plan. So now I began thinking about deployment. Now for deployment, I know that not everyone has the type of hardware that you might need to run an application like this. So I started looking towards other alternatives. How could I web host it, for example? And that's where I came across pixel streaming. Pixel streaming is Unreal's built-in solution for streaming directly to the web. And it's pretty simple to set up, so I'll go over some of the basic steps. The first thing you'll need to do is to enable the plugin in the plugins menu. Then, in the project settings, you'll want to make sure that you have the software cursor set to default, so the cursor actually appears for the user. And then finally, in your package build, you can create a shortcut of the executable where you can apply these flags. And essentially, these will restrict the resolution. You can also choose to render it off screen. Now I won't go into too much detail, but I'll pop a tutorial series up here and link it below as well for anyone that's interested in learning more. But here are my results. Right now, I just have it running locally. But in the future, I want to see if I can have these hosted on either AWS or maybe use a pixel streaming service provider to be able to scale up this a little bit more easily. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the 27 days. I spent day number 27 just adding some last minute stuff to the environment and then filming the actual demo. Now before I jump into the demo, if you made it this far, let me know what you think of the Hub application. I'd love to hear if you have any ideas for other functionality that I might be able to add in a future video. And make sure you hit the like and subscribe button if you want to see more of this in the future. And without further ado, here is the demo of the Hub application.